We're in week 3 of our multi-part series, Early Church versus Modern Church. Today we're looking at the earliest Christians and their lifestyle. How did being a Christian change someone's life? And is there anything that we, in 2024, can learn from that early church? Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Worship Homestead. My name is Nathan Smith. Thanks for joining me. Today we're talking about the lifestyle of the earliest Christians and what we can learn from them. But first I want to give you something. If you go to my website, blueprintsounds.com, you can get access to my free worship training bundle called the Worship Booster Pack. It has PDFs and online classes in everything from songwriting, live sound, how to build a better band, 25 chart-topping arrangement tricks, and much more. All of that is available for free on my website, or click on the link nearby, blueprintsounds.com/worship booster pack. All right, let's talk about the lifestyle of the early church. One of the things you need to know about the early church is just how different they were from the Roman culture around them. They were truly distinct, if not unique, among all of the various groups and ethnic groups and religious expressions there were in Roman culture. And here's how it played into their day-to-day life. I want to warn you ahead of time that this first example is very distressing to think about, and that is what scholars call infant exposure. In Roman times, it was completely normal for the Romans to throw out their unwanted babies. This could be because the babies were deformed in some way, whether they had something like Down syndrome, or they had a limb that was missing or maimed. Those were all perfectly legitimate reasons for the Romans and the Greeks before them to toss out their unwanted children. They would throw them in dung heaps or trash piles or leave them in an abandoned place. And often, other people would come by and pick up those children for the express purpose of raising them as slaves or prostitutes. Another reason why a child might just be thrown out is because she was a girl and not a boy. And to show you how commonplace this practice was, I want to read you a passage from a book. This is called Destroyer of the Gods by Larry Hurtado, and he's a scholar that dealt with specifically the earliest centuries of the church. In the book, Hurtado references this now famous letter from a man named Hilarion, who was probably serving in the Roman army, that he sent to his wife Alice. This was around 1 BC. And it gives us a flavor of how this infant exposure worked. After greeting his wife and other relatives with her at their home, Hilarion begs her to, quote, take care of the little one, their child, promising to send money as soon as he is paid. Then, referring to Alice expecting another child very soon, he writes, if it is a boy, let it be. If it is a girl, cast it out. But then, after this rather blunt order, he continues by expressing his unaltered tender affection for Alice. How can I forget you? I beg you then not to be anxious. Obviously, the man was not a monster and was capable of tender feelings, nor was he unusual for the time in his attitude about infant exposure. That is precisely the point to note. The practice of discarding infants shortly after birth and before they had been accepted by the father as family members was so much a feature of the culture of the Roman period that many otherwise caring people seem to have felt little reluctance about it. Christians abhorred this practice. Not only did they preach against it, but they went and they saved the children from the trash heaps. They would take the children out of the dung piles and they would adopt them and raise them. In many cases, these children were maimed as the result of failed abortions. And so they would care for the children until they died, and then they would give them a dignified burial. Even today, if you go to Italy and you go underneath Rome into the catacombs, you'll see small graves with the inscription, this was the adopted son, or this was the adopted daughter of so-and-so. That's how the Christians treated babies in the early church. Here's another way in which Christians were very distinct from Roman culture. In Rome, when a husband and wife get married, it's expected that the wife remain faithful to the husband and that she stays sexually pure. It's not true of the husband at all. He has a wife, but he could also have a prostitute or a concubine or a mistress, or he could take advantage of any of the slaves that he owned, including young boy slaves as well. Didn't matter. All of that was not just not illegal, it was completely permissible and normal in Roman culture, that the man just got to do whatever he wanted to do. For him, the wife was for having children in an ordinary fashion so that he could leave his inheritance to them. So it was very much a legal matter, but as far as his sexual purity, it didn't didn't really figure into the equation. They didn't think about it. Christians were completely different. Paul states in his letters multiple times that not only is the woman expected to be faithful to her husband, but that the husband is expected to be faithful to his wife. And that was very different. The idea that there would be one standard for men and women in that time period is radical. In addition to that, Christians adamantly opposed adults using children for their sexual pleasure. And you can see this in the language. The Romans of the time would have used a term that sort of translates as lover of boys or loving boys, whereas Christians called it what it was. They called it child abuse or corrupting youth. So their strong language and their adamant opposition is evident even in the choice of words that they use to describe the acts. And finally, Christianity was distinct from the Roman world around it because it pulled from every corner of society. Whereas Roman society was very hierarchical, obviously very male-dominated, but it was also a society which was based upon slavery. You had to have the upper class and you had to have the slaves. That's how Romans thought. And yet Christians could be anything. Christians could be slaves, freemen, men, women, children, Galatians, Jew, Gentile. It didn't matter. Anyone could and did become a Christian. In these ways and many others, the early church was completely distinct from Roman culture. They weren't distinct in their dress or how they ate or where they lived, but in their behavior, they were very, very different from the Roman culture of the time. And the modern world that we live in today with its values is heavily influenced by those early Christians. Here's what I mean. When I told that story about infant exposure, it probably made you uneasy. And the reason it made you uneasy is because of those early Christians. Likewise, when a high-profile politician gets caught in an affair or, we find out that he visited a prostitute, we deem that as a mark on his character. The only reason we do that is because of the early Christians. And finally, the fact that you might fill out a form that asks you for your ethnicity and then your religion, the fact that those two things are separate is a result of the early church. Because until the early church, your ethnicity and your religion were very much linked. They were one and the same, and you worshiped whatever gods you had grown up with. And now there's this new thing called Christianity where it's pulling from all corners of society, and anybody, whoever they may be, Jew or Gentile, could be a Christian. So in many ways, the modern world we live in has Christian values, whether or not we understand where they came from. So now let's look at the modern church. Is it as distinctive in its time as the early church was in its time? And I think by any measure, you would have to say no. We'll just take one example. This was put out by the Pew Research Center, and they asked the question, should homosexuality be accepted by society? And they asked Christians this. In 2007, 58% of Catholics believed that it should be accepted. By 2014, that number had risen to 70%. Mainline Protestants, 56% in 2007. By 2014, 66%. And evangelicals, in 2007, 26% believed that homosexuality should be accepted in society. By 2014, 36%. So is the modern church as distinctive in its time as the early church was in its time? No. And why is that? Well, here's a theory. Without reteaching everything I did in the previous videos, let me just sum up what the early church looked like in its houses of worship and what it did in its gatherings. They met in homes, not exclusively, but often they met in homes in small groups. And when they got together, they ministered to one another. So here we are in 1 Corinthians 14. Paul describes it. He says, when you come together, everyone has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. All of these must be done for the strengthening of the church. In this setting, the early church is ministering to itself. Everyone is getting together in a circle, seeing what the Lord has to say to one another through one another. That's a very, very important distinction to make between what the early church did and what we do today. Today, we meet in a building. Most of us sit in pews facing forward. We look at a stage where a minority of people, a special class of people, do most of the talking and singing. And that's how it's been done for a long time. And that cuts across all the denominations, whether you're Catholic, mainline, evangelical, doesn't matter. That's kind of what it looks like. But it doesn't look like the early church. Why does that make such a big difference? Because the early church was building its own group identity. Don't know if you know this, but your brain has two sides, the left and the right side. And the right side, which thinks first before the left side even knows that the right brain is thinking. The right brain wants to deal with the questions, who am I? Who are my people? How am I supposed to act? This side of your brain is the relational brain. This side of your brain, the left side, is the problem-solving brain. Well, when you get together, just like the early church would have, in a home that's already an intimate fellowship, right? It's already an intimate space. You're looking at other people's faces, and there's actually a transfer of information from eye to eye when you're with someone. When you see someone else's face light up and they're happy to see you, it actually increases your joy level. And then you have all of these people to model your behavior after, including people that are more mature than you, like Paul would have done when he planted the church in Corinth. All of these people are getting to model their behavior after him. They're like, Paul, how do we be a Christian? And through his words, yes, but through his actions, he's showing them, this is how you do it, folks. So they have this intimate, joy-filled community where they are teaching each other with their right brains, this is who you are. You are a Christian. This is how you act. These are your people. This is how the Christian life is lived. They are literally wiring up each other's brains with this mutual ministry. They are transforming the lives of the people that come and meet in that room together. We only have discovered that very recently, that brain science has shown us what happens on the right side of the brain when you have a joy-filled, loving community. But the early church had it thousands of years ago. And unfortunately, we gave it up. We instead opted for what we have right now, which is everything I mentioned, the structures of the churches and the pews and the minority of people that do most of the talking and singing, while everybody else stares at the stage and the back of your neighbor's head. Well, you don't get that same right brain wiring as you do when you're in church today. What you get today with public speaking and all the rest of it is left brain information. And left brain information tells you how to solve problems. It might give you good doctrine and teaching, which are very, very important, but they do not transform your life when what you need is a joy-filled community. And as the modern church went increasingly more towards relevancy, towards seeker-sensitive church, towards getting people into the building, we did a lot on church growth and we actually saw the fruits of our labors, but we didn't see the people that were in the building get transformed, not on the right side of their brain. And now, as we've seen in the last 20 years, as easy as it was for people to come into the building, it's very easy for them to leave the building. They came in, they weren't transformed, and they're leaving untransformed. And not only that, the cultural capital, which was built by the church over the last 1,500 years, where even if you weren't religious, there was a certain moral expectation which was coming from Christianity. Well, now that's degrading, and the world is starting to look a lot more pagan than it used to. What do? Well, maybe we should take a page out of the early church's book. Maybe we should do what's written about in Scripture. Maybe we should come and everybody have a revelation, a teaching, a tongue, an interpretation of a tongue. Maybe following what the Bible said from the beginning isn't such a bad idea after all. Next week, we're going to talk about what that looks like in a very practical way. Hey, I hope that episode helps you, and be sure to check in next week because there's good news, not just bad news. Again, if you need help with your worship team, click on the link nearby, blueprintsounds.com/worship booster pack. If you're listening to the podcast, leave a positive review. It helps me out. Likewise, if you're watching on YouTube, click like and subscribe. Until next week, God bless and goodbye.